Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of Comic Book Workshop. Today we are looking at Jordie Bernet. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. And yeah, so I've got a few select images here. We're going to go through them as usual, and we're just going to break down some of the things it is that we notice uh, about the creative decisions that he's making and how it's helping him communicate visually. Before we do that, I do want to just say that I've been busy with traveling, so that's why I haven't been posting any videos or anything like that. And so I'm hoping I'm going to be getting into at least doing some regular ones again, as well as some podcasts and whatnot. I may end up separating them onto different YouTube channels in the future, but for now, I'm gonna keep them on here. So I've got more stuff coming up here soon to announce, along with some more information on the Kickstarter for my comic, which I'm going to be figuring that out here pretty soon. So, anyways, let's go ahead and let's jump into it. Now, there's a couple of different things it is that I really appreciate about Jordie's work. I'm going to flip through some of the images that we're going to be looking at today just very quickly. And you can see some of these images, they're actually pretty low resolution, which I do apologize for that. Specifically, these three right here. But I decided to go ahead and keep them because, for the purposes of what we're going to be looking at in Jordie's work, it suits what we're looking for. So there's a lot of different creative decisions that have to be made way ahead of time before you can do something in black and white, right? So, for example, in this shot right here, we see that the majority of the bodies of the figures are in white, whereas very little of it is actually in black in terms of like the silhouettes of the figures. If we look at the silhouette of this figure, for example, he's almost primarily in white. He's almost got kind of a white outline, and then there's black shapes that help define the volume of his jacket and the lighting of the situation. Now, this is a decision it is that you want to make ahead of time before you're putting compositions together like this, because you can imagine if earlier in the book, if Jordi had this character over here, had him in a black trench coat, this would have caused a lot of problems. So for at least, I'm sure the trench coat itself is black, but the way he's drawn it is white with black shadows. And so if this had just been totally black, if you could imagine that he just did the whole jacket as black, what we would find is that he would bleed into these background pillars here, and this could make it to where it's not as readable as the rest of the image, right? There's a couple other things it is that I notice about this image that are structural things that are worth considering whenever you're doing your own compositions for panels. And so I drew these lines over it here, and what I want to do is show you a contrast between these pillars. We have these very straight lines in the background here and these shadow shapes. You can see me drawing over them here now. And this is this is kind of providing a kind of balance with the rest of the lines, right? So we could think of these big black rectangular shapes in the background. They are an element of contrast for the rest of the elements of the characters in the room. But they are also basically boundaries of where it is that he wants you to look. Notice that a lot of the area over here has a lot of black in it, right? And there's a lot of detail in it. Whereas in this space, it's mostly the white space, and then we have the two female characters. So this was very deliberate, right? He could have easily drawn and illustrated the background behind these characters, but clearly he wants this to really be your focal point. And the way that we know that is that we can see that all of the heads and the bodies, see, I'm drawing these kind of curves over the head and the body, and the heads and the bodies here are all angled in a way to where it is that they push your eye towards the two dancing figures. And notice that the dancing figures are, well, one of them is connected to a straight line, another straight line. So we have this really interesting breakup of straight lines in the background that create a kind of rhythm, right? It's like we have this medium one, and then we have this large one, another medium one, and then this huge white space, and a little one, and then we have another medium one, right? So there's a balance between these two different spaces of the left and the right of the page that he's able to create by putting a lot of the shadow work over here and dropping these figures into the shadows while allowing the more curvy shapes and lines over here to be our focal point. And this is creating an element of contrast with these more straight lined shapes in the background, right? You have these rectangular shapes in the background that are completely flat black shapes, objects that have fallen into shadow. And then we have these two figures here that are very spontaneous. The gesture is very spontaneous and it's very active and very alive. And so these two things play off of one another and help the artist communicate that these figures are dancing. Because when we take these lines off, we can see, just drawing something like this, these two very dynamic characters dancing and getting them to look like they're actually moving is quite a challenge, right? And so he's able to use these static objects in the environment to help frame these two figures, right? You can basically say this is one big box around them, but it also adds the contrasting element of having static next to dynamic objects, right? And then, of course, we have the storytelling going on here. I'm not familiar with this book, but we have this central character here, and then we have this character from Sin City back here in the background, and he's pulling out a gun. What is he going for? Who is he waiting for? Is he coming up behind this guy, or is he this guy's bodyguard? It can be unclear. Um, and then again, as we go through the rest of these, we'll see just these little different decisions that artists that work in primarily black and white have the ability to make, right? So he's got, if I put another layer on here, he's got kind of this halo kind of circular effect that he's able to create by having a shadow that basically creates a another you could say another box, right? Like we have whenever we draw these comic panels, we have basically these comic panel boxes that look something like this. Well, if you look at a lot of comic artists, they want you to look at the focal point and get the idea of the image immediately. And so it's not unusual, especially for artists that work in black and white, to drop a lot of things into shadow as a way to break up the panel, right? So you could almost think that if the panel is 50% black and 50% white, it's really not going to look that interesting. Whereas if you have something that's a little bit more dynamically broken up, that can make it a little bit more interesting. Like you have this black shape of this shadow that basically encapsulates the image, right? And then we have this figure here that is primarily in shadow. And then we have this white space here where we see the woman showing off her leg. And then she's got some dark space in her as well. But we can see that all these shadows are somewhat connected, right? So even if they want to, I've mentioned before that one way that you can understand this is to basically just block everything in shadow into shadow, right? And make it all one variant. And that's what you see in these black and white artists, right? The shadow underneath her leg and the shadow on the cloth here is the same value for the most part, right? And that shadow is connecting here and it's going up here and connecting with the rest of her body. But even in spaces where they want you to understand that there's clearly an overlap, such as, for example, with this gun here, right? You have this gun. And what's interesting about this is that he creates enough white space around the gun in order for it to not get lost in the shadow of the couch she's sitting on, or in the shadow that the couch is casting. So these are all little decisions it is that are being made. And again, we can clearly see because of the combination of the black shirt with the white outside, we can clearly see that this is the character that we saw in the previous photo, along with the decisions to make the hair kind of fall back, right? So this is one of these images that is the resolution isn't really that great. However, we can see from this image there's a storytelling element going on, and it's interesting to see how by leaving the text out, you can begin to project your own story onto an image. And I think this is a skill that's very underutilized now in comics. I've been looking at some comics recently, and it's always really frustrating to see text where the images could really be the ones that tell the story. But this image, even if I pull back, because the resolution isn't really that good, it still tells you a story in this small little panel, right? And we've got this detective figure in the foreground who seems to be lost in thought, and then we have this woman over here who's given him a side eye, and it looks like there's also a man behind her that's also trying to see what this guy is up to. So depending on the way you look at it, this could be taken in a lot of different ways. Perhaps the woman and the guy over here on the right are in cahoots, and they're conspiring to get his attention. Maybe she's going to get his attention and try to pull him into something, and then this guy will attack him or scam him or something. So these could be enemies posing as friends. It could just be a bystander that's checking him out because he looks, pretty handsome in his hat and his suit here. The other thing it is that I really appreciate about these black and white comic artists is that the need to be so efficient in these black and white comics has allowed them to have like a very high quality line art style. And Jordie's line art is so confident. You can tell by the way he draws this stuff that it feels like he probably just does it all in one go, right? Even though he probably doesn't, but it definitely feels that way. When you're looking at this guy's work, you definitely see a master at work. And again, we have the same sort of thing where creative decisions that are made by artists that are doing things in black and white, it can make things simpler. And because of that, it really forces you to understand design, right? So you have this figure in this white jacket, and of course the background it is that he should be imposed on is something of detail, something that has a lot of black in it, right? And this helps push him forward in the image. So we have this kind of black rectangular shape that's going around our figure. Now, the other way it is that these guys make sure to help show you the volume and the dimensions is that there's always one side that's cast into shadow, right? So over here you have this side is basically cast into shadow, right? And the same thing over here, so we have the opposite. This side of everything is cast into shadow. And just like I had mentioned before, of course, the shadow on this side, it does what? It connects with the background of the figure, right? And again, it helps it stand out, right? If we imagine if the whole head of this figure and the whole body of this figure was just, it didn't have these darker shapes, then what we would have is something that would blend in very well with this white background. So we have this figure that's primarily in white on a black backdrop. Then we have this figure that's primarily shaded in black on a white backdrop, right? So we've seen this quite a lot. There's other different things that it allows uh, comic artists to do that I really appreciate, which is that they can use environmental elements as a way to basically block in characters, can help you block in a scene. Um, but specifically, it helps you differentiate foreground from the background and so on and so forth, right? So this big black shape here, even though I drew it around his hat, it's actually behind his hat, right? The pillar or the structure, which I assume it's another one of these little platforms that cross over into these different buildings. This structure right here helps differentiate that these characters are in the foreground, right? And then there is a midground, which is this structure here. That's what this structure represents. And then there's a background, which are these back here, right? And we can see that even if has something, he has a scene that has to have a foreground, a midground, and a background, he can still be very particular about the way that he drops his black shadows in, and that this helps him uh, create a create an element of depth to the image, right? Another thing that's worth noticing is that the diagonal lines are really helping him with the drama, and he's got a few different diagonal lines going on, and this is something it is that we see a lot in comic art, which is the use of diagonals in lots of different subtle ways. If I find a lot of these straight lines or I find a lot of these diagonals and I just start tracing them out, they start to become really apparent what it is that they're doing, right? So we can look at this and we can say, well, we have this diagonal line that's cutting across here. We have this diagonal line that's cutting across here. We have these very subtle diagonal lines from the perspective of these buildings that are reaching out this way, and they're all interlining with what? With these two figures. And of course, you have it from this side as well, which is really clever, right? He's using these different environmental elements to help him compose the image it is that he's putting together. And then you've got these two figures here, which obviously are our focal points, but they are almost more like straight lines or more like curved lines. Like obviously she's got a lot of curve in her, right? But he has curve in him as well. His shoulders are kind of curved up, and his hand is coming out, right? So it's pretty interesting how you can use something that to somebody who's a beginner artist you would think, oh well, it's just straight lines or diagonal lines. How many uses could you find of that? Well, if you really study these master artists, you'll find that they have so many different ways that they use these things in very subtle ways to direct your eyesight and to make an image that is visually compelling. Because if I take this off, this is a very visually compelling image, right? Again, this is another one of these images that is the resolution isn't really that good, so I'll keep it back. But we have these great contrasting elements. We have this masculine and feminine going on. We have this kind of drop shadow sort of thing that cuts through the image, right? And notice where it is that he puts it, that he allows the black to overlap with the hat, but the side of the hat that is facing the light is the one that gets the shadow, right? So he puts the shadow here, he puts the shadow here, he puts it along the rim of this hat, he puts it on this side, but then he leaves this white, right? So all this is in black. And what a coincidence that you can basically see that these are different areas that have black in them, right? So you can see from this image that he does a really good job of kind of doing this back and forth sort of thing, right? So we have like this big black shape here, and then the next black shape before going down, as we see it's on the side of his hat, which helps give dimension to the hat. It's the tie or the bow around the hat, and then his face on the left side begins to fall into shadow along with the rest of his body, right? So you could say that this shadow shape is connected in some ways to this one, right? But then over here we have these darker shapes on her body, and they're much more separate, you could say. Here's the last one we'll look at. This is the one that I opened up with. I think this is a pretty rad image, and it really is a good way of summing up everything it is that we're talking about in this image, right? There's something about Jordie's work that is just it just speaks of lots and lots of time drawing. You know, he has spent obviously a lifetime perfecting his skill set, and we're lucky enough to be able to look at somebody like this and to really help them or to really help ourselves get better. We can begin to analyze and break down the way it is that people create these images, right? And so right now I'm boxing in some of these black shapes, and I'm just drawing some basic shapes over them, right? And what's really interesting to me is that we can start to see these patterns between these different things depending on depending on how much attention it is that we place on these things, right? We can begin to notice all sorts of different patterns, all sorts of um, different things about our art as well as other people's art. And some of them might not even be apparent to the people that made it, because a lot of the times the creative decisions the artists are making is, they're pretty substantial, right? So if I just take that and if I pull the image back, and this is just some of the tracing of some of the dark shapes, but you can start to see that there is, even with just these black shapes, if I'm just taking those and singling those out, you can start to see that something is beginning to become apparent. There's a pattern that is taking place. Let me fill this with right, make it a little bit easier to see, right? But you can start to see that there's certain patterns that begin to show up, right? We have obviously on the left over here and on the right over here, we have this same thing of trying to frame an image. So it's a frame within a frame. He's using the environmental elements as a way to frame it. But then he's also using this building back here, and the way that he's positioned the building is giving us this shadow shape on this side as it comes down and connects with our figure here, which is pretty interesting, right? It helps push this figure forward, and then on the figure himself, we see that we have We have some shadows here and some darker shapes here, but they're in specific places, right? They're in the cusp of the underarm here, right? And they're underneath both of his arms here. And both of these spaces here help communicate a level of depth, right? And notice that he keeps the head out of shadow, even though the hat itself would probably be casting some sort of a shadow, right? So this is a great little image to end it on here. I hope you found this to be useful. Like I said, I'm going to be coming out. I'm going to continue to do these regularly and continue to talk about different comic artists and artists that I love in general, as well as sharing my own process of creating my own comics. Which, if you would like to get updated on my Kickstarter for my next comic, keep subscribed to this channel. I've got some links in the description box below that you can go and check out as well, along with my website where you can get prints and different things like that. Soon I will be recording my big Frazetta tutorial that I'm going to be putting on Gumroad. I had advertised it in the last video it is that I put on here, but I've been a little bit busy, so I'm going to be getting to that here soon. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Take care and let me know what you think, and take care.